We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. Thank you for joining us. We are going to address this topic of birthright citizenship so that we can get some solid clarity about what exactly is going on with respect to this construct. To be clear, the United States is not operating as a democracy. It is also not operating as a republic. The United States operates as a theocracy, and that theocracy is rooted largely in Scripture. That is why it is so important for you to understand Scripture along with law. Now, this takes us to the topic of birthright citizenship and the United States Constitution. It is important to note that birthright is not something that is in the United States Constitution. And so there is a lot of talk about birthright citizenship and constitutionality, but birthright is not in the United States Constitution. If you review the Constitution, you will see that this is the case. However, birthright appears somewhere else. And it's very important where birthright appears for our understanding of what birthright is really all about. So what's going on with this birthright construct? And why is this the language that is used, this birthright dynamic? Now, we discussed jus sanguinis and jus soli before. We're going to go into it a little bit more deeply with respect to this birthright citizenship dynamic. And so where we find birthright, of course, you already know where it is. It's in Scripture. And that's where this construct is coming from. And this construct of birthright is being offered to create quite a bit of confusion because birthright means something very specific. And what is being discussed with respect to birthright citizenship is not what birthright is all about. And so when you hear the construct of birthright, you need to go straight to Scripture so that you understand what birthright is really all about. Birthright citizenship is not a legal construct. Birthright is a biblical construct. It doesn't take much to understand that we are operating under a form of a theocracy. Even when you look at the laws of the United States, they are coming from the book of Deuteronomy. They are coming from the book of Exodus. They are coming from the book of Genesis. And so the laws that are in place in the United States are transplanted laws. These are imposed laws from abroad. And so these are not indigenous laws. And it's important to keep in mind that these laws are coming from a theocratic perspective. And so that's what we are really operating under. And so when we are talking about birthright citizenship and this construct of the birthright, we are talking about an inheritance right. And so with respect to birthright citizenship, we are talking about a specific type of citizenship. And it's not the type of citizenship that people have been led to believe it is about. According to Scripture, there is only one birthright citizen, and the only birthright citizen is the American Indian. This has nothing to do with the 14th Amendment. This has to do with the construct of birthright.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives
And so another way of understanding the birthright citizen is the First Nations. Why? Because birthright is about the first. Birthright is not about where you are born in terms of the United States, in terms of scripture. Birthright is about being first. The other understanding of birthright is legal heir. And so when you look at it this way, you can see that this is not about this birthright citizenship that people are talking about. Birthright is about heirship. And so the only entities that have heirship on this land are those who are considered indigenous. And to be clear, you can see that the synonym in Webster's dictionary for birthright is inheritance. And so clearly, this is not about this idea of migrating from one place to another, being born in one place versus another. This is about being the firstborn and the inheritance rights of the firstborn. Now we're going to look at some interesting analogies related to this inheritance issue and the birthright. Now, before we go deeper into this topic, it is important to note a unique birthright dynamic related to the collective known as ADOS. In other words, American Descendants of Slaves. The 14th Amendment is specifically related to ADOS. In other words, it is the amendment for ADOS. And so in that way, it is a special birthright amendment for a specific group of people. And that is the collective known as American Descendants of Slaves. However, with respect to the 14th Amendment, a number of other entities also achieved citizenship status. And this included individuals who are now identifying as foundational Black Americans. It's important to note that foundational Black Americans, which by the way, is a very diverse collective. The foundational Black Americans are not the same as ADOS. And so someone can be a foundational Black American and be ADOS, or a person can be indigenous and ADOS. But that 14th Amendment is specifically for ADOS, regardless of what ethnic category a person might have been placed in. And so that's important to keep in mind. And we're going to go into the 14th Amendment and do a little analysis of that in another discussion. But right now we are focusing on this birthright dynamic with respect to the indigenous people of the Americas. And here you see this notation about the history of the 14th Amendment. One of the things that you need to look at when you are looking at laws, you're looking at these acts, it's important to look at the history. How did this thing come about, this piece of legislation, this statute, this code, this amendment? How did it come about? What was the intention of the entity that put forward whatever piece of legislation we are talking about? And so with respect to the 14th Amendment, what has come up now is the fact that based upon the history of the 14th Amendment, it's a part of a package, this sort of Reconstruction package. And so it definitely is aimed at or aimed towards those who were formerly enslaved. And so here you see this specification of the 14th Amendment, or this birthright citizenship is meant for the babies of slaves. Babies of slaves is simply another way of saying ADOS. When you say descendants, you're talking about babies. So American descendants of slaves would be the American babies of slaves. And so it's the same thing. And so here, this is a clarification about the intent of the 14th Amendment and the perceived limitations on the 14th Amendment. Now, this is important because there were other pieces of legislation that only gave certain groups of people this citizenship status. And so ADOS achieved this citizenship status based upon the 14th Amendment. And so I also need to disentangle this dynamic of foundational Americans because there are many foundational Americans. Technically, the only foundational American is the American Indian or the indigenous people of America. However, there is a collective of other people that can be identified as these foundational Black Americans. Now, with respect to the entities that fall under this umbrella, and I want to clarify that the individuals are brown Americans. And so we are really going to have to reconcile that whole Black construct because there's something about that that is inconsistent with reality, and it really is about a status versus an actual phenotype, but it can become confusing after a while. And so when we're talking about foundational brown Americans, we need to disentangle some entities because this collective is large and it is not simply made up of indigenous people and it's not simply made up of American descendants of slaves. And so you have these foundational entities based upon different factors. Now, with respect to the foundational brown Americans, we have, of course, the brown trafficked people, various people who were trafficked into the American space. Among these people are entities known as brown European convict transport. And so these entities that are talking about deporting people right now, they have a history with this. And in fact, if they trace their ancestry, many of them will find that their own ancestors were convicts and deported and into the Americas. And so we have the specific brown European convict transports, and we've talked about those before with respect to those persons of quality. Another collective to keep in mind is the Black nobility. And so in Europe, there was a pouring out of Europe and into America of these brown nobles, understood as Black nobles or Black nobility. And so that's a specific class of these foundational, quote unquote, Black Americans. And so we have to keep that in mind. And so when we're talking about FBA or foundational Black Americans, we are talking about a large collective of people, and they are quite diverse with diverse interests and diverse backgrounds. And then specifically, you have the brown European colonists, the entities that were brown, that were coming out of Europe, that were colonizers. Okay, so it's important to keep them in mind. And then you have the Moriscos and the Moranos, who by and large were varying shades of brown. And so these individuals would be those conversos. They might not have been conversos, however, and so they might have just been hiding these identities. But we have the brown Moriscos and the Moranos. And then ultimately the brown indigenous. However, the brown indigenous don't fall under this idea of foundational Black Americans in terms of technicality here. And the 14th Amendment didn't apply to the brown indigenous. They did not get citizenship status with the 14th Amendment. And there is a question even now as to whether the indigenous people of the Americas, specifically America, this mainland, whether they actually are citizens of the United States or not. And so it's a very complicated dynamic going on there. But when talking about these foundational Black Americans, it's important to remember that we are talking about diverse people. with diverse backgrounds, and they might even have conflicting interests. And so this isn't some one big happy community. And so you don't have the black nobility having the same interests as enslaved people coming out of Africa and India and parts of Asia and parts of Europe. These are not the same people, okay? They are not the same people genetically, and they are not the same people culturally. And so that needs to be made clear. And it also needs to be made clear that there should be no conflation going on between brown indigenous and the foundational black Americans. And also, we need to be careful about conflations related to foundational black Americans and brown people who were trafficked into America.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
Now let's venture back to the birthright discussion related to the indigenous people. We're going to look at some analogies related to the indigenous people and this birthright construct that we find in scripture specifically. Now, these analogies will help you to better understand this entire construct of birthright and why it's at the forefront. And so, with respect to scripture and the birthright and America, what we have is America, or the Americans, the indigenous people, represent Esau, or Esau is a representative of the indigenous people. The colonists are representative of Rome and Babylon. They are representative of Rome and Babylon for a few reasons. One reason is that Rome is the entity that sent the colonization forward. And so the colonization process went all around the world coming from Rome. However, many of the entities involved in the colonization process also identify as entities, in terms of scripture, emerging out of Babylon. And so, with respect to the entities that are emerging out of Rome, emerging out of Babylon, those entities represent Jacob, or Jacob serves as a representation for the colonists. So, America, Esau, colonists, Jacob. This brings us to this construct of foundational Americans. This construct of foundational Americans has grown. Okay, so it started off with this foundational black Americans. Now we have foundational white Americans. Pretty soon we'll have foundational yellow Americans and foundational brown Americans. Regardless of how you look at it with respect to this foundational dynamic, these foundational entities are representing colonizer entities. And so, with respect to that foundational dynamic, we are not talking about indigenous people. Foundation is very interesting because foundation, that construct of foundation, if you recall, is related to yet another entity. And Jacob represents this idea of foundation, this idea of setting something somewhere or placing something somewhere that it might not have been in the first place. And so that construct of foundational and foundation is tied to the construct of Set or Seth.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
And so, with respect to Egyptian mythology, we have America being represented by Horus, or Horus representing those who would be considered indigenous. In other words, the rightful heir. And then The colonists are represented by Set or Seth, or Set serves as a representation of the colonists.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
Now, there are many dynamics that situate the colonists in the shoes of Jacob. If you recall the narratives about Jacob, you recall that at birth, Jacob was understood as a heel catcher. And so Jacob was following at the heel. And so the colonists followed the firstborn. The firstborn would be the indigenous. So you have Jacob following at the heel, pursuing at the heel. You have the colonists doing this. You have Jacob involved in deception and usurpation in order to get this inheritance or get what Jacob wanted. And you have the colonists engaging in deception and usurpation. You also have this foundational dynamic. And if you look back at the discussions we've had about Set or Seth, you know that foundation, put, place, arrange, all of those things are related to Set, this replacement dynamic. And that's what Set or Seth was all about. So in terms of the narrative, Eve was identifying Set or Seth as replacing not only Abel, but also replacing Cain. And so there's this whole replacement dynamic going on as a part of the Set theocracy. And so part of the Set theocracy involves the replacement of the first. And so if you go back into Egyptian mythology again, you have the replacement of Horus. And so that is the paradigm under which the colonists were operating. It's also noteworthy that the colonists, the Scots in particular, identified themselves as being associated with Scotia. They identified themselves with being associated with ancient Egypt. And they also identified with Set. And so there is this identification with this replacement dynamic, this replacing of the first within the colonizer identity. And so there's this replacement demography going on with the colonial enterprise. What we also have with the colonial descendants is an apparent amnesia, because many people are operating in the Americas as if they have forgotten history, as if they don't have another homeland, as if they sprouted up from the soil. And so many entities pretend to be the Horus. They pretend to be Esau. They pretend to be the indigenous. And this is done by referring to oneself as American, simply. There are many people who have supplanted the indigenous people, moved into their spaces, and pushed them out of their spaces. And this is going along with this identity appropriation. This is going along with that usurpation, that supplanting dynamic. And then there are all of these justifications for the usurpation. And so, in other words, the descendants of the colonizers are down with the get down. And this is part of the reason why there is quite a bit of anxiety going on right now with all of these different groups of people, because they have been down with the get down. They have been down with the identity appropriation. They have been down with the removal dynamics. Many people have been benefiting from this entire situation wherein Esau, America, has been deprived of the birthright. However, that birthright term keeps coming up, and it is a guarantee that many people who are using the birthright term, they understand what the birthright term is really all about. The birthright term is really about Esau. Now, in terms of colonization, there was the flipping of the birthright, and Esau became subjugated under Jacob. And so this was that theft of the birthright. This is that theft of the blessing. This is that deception that took place.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
That brings us to this analogy related to the treaties. Now, when you look at the treaties, and of course, it's difficult to look at all of them because there are so many treaties. However, with respect to many of the treaties that have been reviewed, what we see with the treaties is that the treaties involved that Jacob's stew dynamic. Remember, Jacob made the stew, and Esau gave up his birthright for the stew because he was so hungry. So what happens with the treaties, when you look at the treaties have a bunch of stew in them. And the treaties are offering the indigenous people stew in exchange for the birthright. They are offering stew in exchange for the inheritance of the indigenous people. And also embedded in the treaties are disguises, all sorts of guises within the treaties. And so you see this Jacob and Esau dynamic going on throughout the entire history. You see this birthright game going on from the very beginning. There were designs to supplant the indigenous people, to erase the indigenous people, and then have Jacob, if you will, step into the shoes of the indigenous people, step into Esau's shoes. And what you also see with respect to the treaties are these odd dynamics that also go along with the Jacob and Esau narrative. Let's look at a few of those. Now, we already know that these treaties are fraudulent. They are fake. But what we see in the treaties are actual subjugation agreements. And so when you look at the treaties, you see that there is this purported agreement by the indigenous people to be subjugated. And you also see this dynamic where there's a purported agreement to have Jacob be the Lord over Esau, if you will. Also embedded in the treaties are these identity appropriation agreements. And so you basically have a remake of the Jacob and Esau narrative inside of the treaties, inside of the history of the Americas. And so the Jacob and Esau paradigm has been played out all over the world, not just in the United States. So what else do we have with respect to this colonist indigenous birthright issue? What we have with colonization is that the colonists came in as guests, very similar to what happens when people are migrating today. They come in as guests. Sometimes they stay for a little while. Sometimes they stay for a lifetime. But there is the understanding in current times that people are guests when they first come in. With the colonists went from being guests to being possessors. At the same time, the indigenous people went from being the owners to the dispossessed.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
There are a few interesting notations about the treaties and this dynamic of the older serving the younger. And so, if you recall in scripture, the dynamic is that Esau has put himself in a position to serve Jacob as Jacob takes Esau's identity and gives Esau Jacob's identity. Very interesting. And so, with respect to the treaties, there is an attempt to create this two-state system, sovereigns on top of sovereigns, basically. And so there is this creation of these political dependencies. And so those who would be understood as recognized tribes or civilized tribes, they have put themselves under the lordship of the colonial entities. And with respect to that, you have again that whole dynamic of the two-state solution that you hear about in current times over in the East. And so that two-state solution has already been created in many of these colonial enterprises, and the United States is no exception. And so, with respect to this birthright dynamic, there is the recognition of the birthright, but there is also this attempt to incorporate this Jacob and Esau dynamic into the colonial enterprise in the United States. And so now we're going to visit the birthright game in Scripture. And so you see birthright identified in Strong's Hebrew 1060 and 1062. And the word is Bokora, birthright, meaning firstborn. That is the meaning of birthright. Birthright means firstborn. It does not mean born on some soil. It means firstborn. And so, therefore, it is a misnomer to identify people that have come in to the United States as a part of the colonial enterprise. It's a misnomer to identify anything about such entities as a birthright dynamic. Now, of course, that whole foundational construct seeks to supplant the birthright construct because foundational sounds very similar to first foundation. But foundation does not necessarily mean birthright. It doesn't necessarily mean firstborn or first.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
So it's important to remember that with respect to the firstborn, we are talking about the dynamic of primogeniture. And so we are talking about that birthright dynamic, the right to inherit. And it doesn't matter how far back that so-called full-blood Indian might happen to be in someone's lineage. It can go back 100, degrees there, and you still have this indigenous baby. And so they are talking about the birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment and it applying to the babies of slaves. The 14th Amendment might apply to the babies of slaves, but the birthright only applies to the indigenous, the firstborn among the brethren. And so there are some very odd dynamics that we are dealing with here with respect to conflating birthright with the 14th Amendment. And so, with respect to birthright, we have this Bakura, meaning firstborn or firstling.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
And here you see it is the firstling of a man or a beast, abstractly primogenitor. And so we also see that this idea is in Strong's and it's consistent. And so you see birthright, and the synonym for birthright is firstborn. The synonym for birthright is not 14th Amendment. And so when people hear this idea of stripping birthright citizenship, uh, people need to ask more questions about this whole birthright dynamic, because the idea of stripping birthright citizenship would appear to be tied to the Indian Citizenship Act, because the birthright is the indigenous. And so, with respect to the birthright citizenship is not simply about being born in a particular place, as the 14th Amendment is discussing. And we've addressed this before, but it's very interesting that this whole idea of birthright and firstborn and primogeniture, that all of these constructs are feminine. And here, of course, you can see the transliterations for Bakura. Now, around the world, there are indigenous people, and all of those indigenous people would be considered birthright. They would be considered the firstborns. And those that came after them would be those that came after them. They would not have the birthright. They would not be identified by the construct of birthright, because the birthright belongs to the indigenous people. And get this, everyone has a birthright. And so there is a place where someone's ancestors were actually first. And it is incumbent upon people to understand where their ancestors have come from and the land in which their ancestors were first. There needs to be a little bit more energy put into that particular enterprise. Where is everyone coming from? Where is everyone's homeland? It's great that we are able to go around the world and visit each other and even stay for a while, or even be integrated into various collectives around the world. This is a great thing. However, there needs to be respect for the birthright, not this Jacob-like constant usurpation of everyone's birthright around the world. There needs to be respect for the dignity of the firstborns. There needs to be respect for the right to exist for the firstborns. That's the birthright right there, the right to exist. And you hear a number of people talking about the right to exist. Well, the right to exist extends to everyone. Everyone has a right to exist. And specifically, everyone has a right to exist in their actual motherland or fatherland, or however they want to term it. The homelands of the indigenous belong to the indigenous. It doesn't matter who is on the land at any given time. The land actually belongs to the indigenous around the world. And so with respect to Scotland, Scotland had indigenous people. Ireland had indigenous people. Wales had indigenous people. France, Germany, Turkey had indigenous people. Canaan land had indigenous people. Ghana had indigenous people. Nigeria had indigenous people. Sudan had indigenous people. India had indigenous people. China had indigenous people. There were indigenous people in all of the isles. And the indigenous people in all of those places have a right to exist. When collectives refuse to give or respect the right to exist to the indigenous people, it's time for the visitors to go home. Home can be Scotland. Home can be Austria. Home can be Switzerland. Home can be Uganda. Home can be South Africa. Home can be Ghana, Togo. Home can be China. Home can be Thailand. Home can be Cambodia. Home can be a number of places. Greenland. Home is where one's ancestors emerged from. And with respect to indigenous people, when indigenous people are on their land, they have nowhere else to go. They are home. And their right to exist needs to be respected. Now, what's interesting is that many people don't respect this right. But then at the same time, they want someone to respect their right to exist on someone else's land. They want someone to respect their right to do whatever they want to do in someone else's homeland, to just plant themselves down, take over, and pretend that the indigenous people do not exist. And then they want to become incensed when someone does to them what they are colluding in with respect to the indigenous people. Once you show that you are down with the get down, then the get down will present itself to you. And that is the case that we are dealing with respect to the indigenous people and those who have sought to supplant the indigenous people. If you believe in supplanting, you will be supplanted.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
Home can be Jamaica. Home can be Finland. Home can be Norway. Home can be Ethiopia. Home can be Saudi. Home can be Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. Home can be the various isles throughout the world. Home can be Italy. Home can be Pakistan. Home can be Portugal. Home can be Spain. Home can be Colombia. Home can be England.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
Now here we see another notation with respect to this replacement of the firstborn. Now, if you recall in scripture, there are these repeated narratives, like this is the way of life in scripture: supplanting, usurpation, deception, taking birthrights, all of that. Within scripture, what you will find is the repetition of this dynamic. And it's repeated in so many different ways that you might just sort of get lost in it and not recognize that it's going on. And so here we have some notations about shifting birthrights. It's an interesting way to identify that. And so this discussion is talking about these shifting birthrights with respect to Jacob's descendants. And so Reuben, technically, is supposed to be the one who is the head of the family. Reuben is supposed to be the one who has the kingship, the headship, the priesthood, if you will. Reuben is supposed to be first. Okay? But what took place in this narrative is multiple people were being shifted around, and Reuben was brought down below his siblings. And Reuben was supplanted by Joseph, Judah, and Levi. And so with respect to Joseph, Joseph was elevated by the father because Joseph essentially was a favored child. And then somehow the slave trading Judah gained the kingship. And then Levi, with the interesting history of Levi gained the priesthood. And so you had all of these siblings supplanting Reuben to create this ongoing dynamic of the usurpation of the birthright, the usurpation of the firstborn. And so this is a part of the theocratic dynamic. Part of the theology is this belief in these shifting birthrights, the practice of the shifting birthrights, the supplanting of the birthright. And so when we are hearing these discussions about birthright citizenship, we need to get a little clarity about exactly what we are talking about when we are talking about birthright citizenship or ending birthright citizenship. What are we talking about exactly? And then, of course, there is this odd language such as naturalize. And this goes right along with this birthright citizenship construct. All of these are artificial constructs. No one can be made native by simply going through an induction process. And so again, this is another dynamic wherein usurpation of this birthright identity is at play. Because again, the only entities that are indigenous are the indigenous.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
And of course, all of the Americas are homelands. All of the Pacific Islands, homelands. All of the Atlantic Islands, homelands.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our
And you know, it is a very simple fact that the overwhelming majority of people that are on the land that is now understood as America or the United States, the overwhelming majority of people are actually visitors. And so the overwhelming majority of people are not native to the land. They are not indigenous to the land. They don't have the birthright to the land. However, many people are behaving as though they have the birthright and as if they are not visitors, but owners of the land. And not just owners, but God given owners of the land. And this is inaccurate, even based upon Judeo Christian belief systems. And finally, as we wrap this up, there is another interesting thing to make note of with respect to all of this talk about uh, changing this citizenship pathway or this citizenship dynamic. With respect to what is being coined birthright citizenship, what is being suggested is that the overwhelming majority of people on the land currently do not have a right to citizenship. And so when you look at the history of people and how their ancestors arrived, when their ancestors arrived, you have a situation wherein many of the people who feel very comfortable in their positions, um, there are questions about their citizenship legitimacy with respect to these birthright citizenship challenges. And so many people who don't believe that they would be challenged or that their citizenship might be at risk, they might find that based upon these discussions that are going on, that just about anybody can get it. With respect to the way that things are being situated in a way that anybody might be at risk for this loss of citizenship. Now, of course, with respect to the indigenous people, gaining or losing United States citizenship is neither here nor there, because whether they are U.S. citizens or they are not U.S. citizens, they are always the first nation.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
We are the land.
This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
We are the land.